conviction that her child was, as the priest had stated, possessed, and that he was performing a miracle to drive out the evil spirit. The mother actually assisted the priest in this horrible work. He requested a tub of water and some salt, which she provided him. Quote, "The innocent little sufferer lay bleeding and insensible, while the priest poured the contents of the tub over her, and as the mixture mingled with the streams of life, he exclaimed, 'Behold, I have turned the water into blood.' He then turned the tub over, and according to some reports, the priest danced a jig and sat on top of the tub with the child under it for over 3 hours. The whole time the edge of the tub was in the child's neck. One report claims it was the edge of the tub on the child's neck which completed the tragedy and ended its sufferings. John Carroll warned the parents not to allow anyone into the room or touch the child until he returned. The parents religiously obeyed the priest's directions and waited for him anxiously to return. The next day, the priest's sister visited the parents of the child, telling them that when her brother returned, the child would be well. John Carroll was found a few days later roaming in the town of Wexford. He was apprehended and sent to Wexford jail, and in August he was put on trial along with 5 of his parishioners for murder. 2 trial reports survived for this case. One was printed in Dublin and the other one was in London. That's the title page for the London one. The London edition contains strong anti-Catholic undertones. The author ridicules Catholic doctrines, the beliefs of the Catholic Irish peasantry, and portrays the event as a tragedy resulting from fanatical superstition. The language and tone are quite strong. For example, quote, "There has never been in the records of civilized society a more dreadful exhibition of bigotry and cruelty than has taken place in Ireland." The author then asks, quote, "how a number of persons could stand tamely by and see an infant victim put to a cruel and lingering death under such a pretext was a degree of callous superstition and cold-blooded bigotry which could hardly be paralleled." The main concerns of the London edition were the extraordinary influence of the Roman Catholic priesthood over their flocks. How the influence was attained or secured wasn't a question, but, quote, "they existed to a degree we could have hardly conceived." It's the title page of the Dublin site, or the Dublin edition. The Dublin edition, on the other hand, appears to be the fullest, most objective account of the events of the 9th of July. Although written anonymously, one could speculate the author was a lawyer, as he stated he recorded the information in shorthand during the trial, but was later commissioned to publish it as a pamphlet. Included in the Dublin report are the witness statements, the coroner's reports, and the medical opinion of John Carroll's physician, as well as another doctor's examination from the 10th of July. That's just what John Carroll looks like. Time doesn't permit me to go into too much detail regarding the trial reports, but from the witness statements, particularly that of the child's father, a number of important beliefs of the Irish peasantry are revealed. Firstly, the extent to which the power was bestowed upon priests, and secondly, that people who were prone to fits or illnesses were demonically possessed. To highlight these beliefs, I'll read an extract from Thomas Sinnett's statement. "When I came into the house, I heard the child crying. I made for it, but was stopped by some persons. Some of the people desired me to be quiet and kneel down, as the priest was going to perform a miracle. All the people knelt down and we prayed. When I found the child was dead, I took her in my arms and showed her to the priest. He desired me to lay it down again on the bed. He was asked, 'Did you make no observation to Father Carroll on his conduct?' He replied, 'I did not, as I thought he would return and bring the child to life again.' When he was asked, 'Do you think he could bring the dead back to life?' he replied, 'It is my opinion that he could.' At 4 o'clock in the morning, he called the priest into the room and remained sitting with him in the bed for 5 minutes. He claims he took the child in his arms and showed it to the priest again and asked him what he should do. The priest replied he desired him to resign it to the will of God. So he laid the child in the bed again and Mr. Carroll went away." Mr. Sennett was cross-examined. The author of the trial report summarises it as follows. "The child was subject to sickness. Father Carroll had previously said prayers over the child. It was the opinion of the people as well as the witness that the person subject to fits and possessed of evil spirits. Father Carroll was considered by people to possess superior power to other priests, and it was universal opinion that numerous miracles had been worked by Father Carroll." One further remark about the beliefs of the Irish peasantry was made by Mr. Bennett during his cross-examination of Dr. Rennick, who was the physician who examined Carroll on the 10th of July. In response to Rennick's comments that Carroll was, quote, "raving and speaking incoherently about devils he had driven out of people," Mr. Bennett remarked, "There was such a thing as second sight belief in Scotland, and in the north of Ireland the existence of witches was believed. It's therefore not at all wonderful that our poor peasantry should have their miracles. The most crucial revelation to transpire during the trial was from the defence, Dr. Devereux, John Carroll's own physician. He admitted he had been treating John Carroll for a number of years, but for at least 3 of those he had queried his insanity and had been prescribing medication which was proven to be effective. He revealed that in July, John Carroll had not been in receipt of medication for at least 2 months, and throughout the time he had known John Carroll, he had thought him religiously fanatic, especially regarding belief in evil spirits and the devil. Devereux states, Carroll laboured under a determination of blood to the head, confusion of ideas and an impaired memory, and his intellect was so weak he didn't think he was capable of understanding the simplest subjects. He was what medical men call having a predisposition to insanity. On the night the tragedy occurred, Devereux had actually passed John Carroll on the road and thought he had the appearance of being deranged. Quote, I saw him in the gripe of a ditch by the roadside with his hat off and his coat covered with dust and a number of people about him. Furthermore, cross-examination revealed that Carroll's parish priest knew of his insanity but hadn't prevented him from officiating during the periods that he was subject to this attack of insanity. In the end, the jury found 5 men not guilty, but John Carroll was declared not guilty, being at the time insane. Carroll was sent back to Wexford Jail and was later transferred to Richmond Asylum in September 1824. The map just shows where Richmond is. Developments in broader contemporary context determined not only the legal authorities' response to this case, but they explained the sectarian reactions of the press and the London Trial Report. In both the press and the London Trial Report, it's the Catholic belief in miracles and the power which people invest in the priest that generates the most anti-Catholic feelings. This was perhaps intensified by Bishop Doyle's pastoral address in 1823, confirming the alleged miracles performed by Prince Hohenlohe. This leads the London Trial Report to claim that the events of July 1824 were linked to this belief. Quote, we have now a practical result of the consequences of the doctrine of miracles as lately enforced and recommended to their flocks by the Roman Catholic bishops, Dr. Murray and Doyle. These views are not representative of all Catholic Irish bishops or priests. John Carroll and Bishops Murray and Doyle were a minority whose outdated beliefs were inconsistent with the desire for reforms. The Catholic Church went through a process of internal reform, raising behavioural standards and pastoral performance of the clergy. Evidence of these reform processes exists in certain areas before the famine, but it wasn't until the post-famine period that the reforms became widely visible. This is linked to the idea of a devotional revolution regarding the influence of Catholic priests over the minds and behaviour of the laity. Sean Connolly argues it was real but limited. Reactions of the legal authorities, however, were influenced more so by social developments. Legislation for provision of specialist institutions for those deemed insane was introduced in 1817, although Swiss Hospital and Richmond were established much earlier. The medical profession had advanced in terms of establishing insanity and attempting to relieve symptoms, as can be seen from the physician's reports in the trial. For example, Dr. Rennick states, Carroll was so insane I was obliged to put him under restraint, and that he did not put Carroll in a straitwaistcoat but instead bled him profusely from his temporal artery. It's important to note that the Irish Witchcraft statute was repealed in 1821. As far as the authorities were concerned, witchcraft and associated beliefs no longer qualified as judicial problems, but rather they were treated as medical ones. Bearing this in mind, the authorities' issues with the Carroll case wasn't the references to supernatural beliefs of the Irish peasantry, rather it was establishing Carroll's insanity, the fact that he had a position of responsibility which he abused, and the non-intervention of the crowd or his parish priest. Even if the statute hadn't been repealed, the main concerns of the authorities would still have been determining Carroll's insanity at the time he committed the murder. In conclusion, this case, particularly the way it was handled by the authorities, demonstrates that while the lower orders retained belief in miracles and possession, elite mentality had advanced in favour of medical explanations for supernatural beliefs. In addition, this case also shows those who envisioned Catholic reforms faced both an internal and an external challenge. That's just what Richmond Asylum looks like today. Thanks.
Okay. So I have questions for all the speakers, including my good self, after. I'm going to do my paper now, and there'll be a couple of readings from the book, which if you haven't bought your copies already, I think there's a couple left that you can buy at the end. I'll just get the PowerPoint presentation. PowerPoint, eh? Okay. I think all the speakers today deserve credit, not only because they've put up with me as a supervisor for the PhD, but you know, it's hard, especially at the start of your research, to share it with big crowds, because you're a big crowd in the annals of history. You sometimes get only like 3 or 4 people, but you know, I think this is a popular subject anyway. Thanks again to the people from No Alibi's bookstore in Belfast for coming along tonight and selling the books for us. It's much better than Amazon having bricks and mortar. I think there's not many of them about anymore. If you look at the end notes of the book, the detail what about the research up from, you know, the primary sources that were survived from the period, you'll see numerous references to PRONI where you're sitting today. It's a testament to the breadth of the PRONI holdings, along with the catalogue and skill of its archivists, that a social historian like myself is able to find stuff on an esoteric subject like Islandmagee witches. Archives are the lifeblood of the academic historian, as well as the local and the amateur historian, and so it's with great pleasure that for the second time I give a talk here at PRONI. I also used to be an archivist here a long time ago. I used to work with Stephen. I'm going to talk a bit about the background to the writing of the history of the witchcraft and magic in Ireland, and more specifically about the Islandmagee witchcraft trials. I've been studying history of witchcraft and magic for a long time. I studied it as an undergraduate and did my Masters at University of St Andrews in the opponents of witch hunting in England in the early modern period. While researching this subject, I discovered the work of a witchcraft skeptic, Bishop Francis Hutcheson, and that's the good man there. He was later Bishop of Down and Connor, and he's buried in Portland, okay, under the church floor, along with his sister. He was Bishop of Down and Connor from 1660 to 1739, and he wrote about witchcraft. He would become the focus of my PhD and the focus of my first book, Witchcraft and Wigs, which you can see there. It was published in 2009. So this is where, when people ask me, how did you get into doing the history of witchcraft, this is how. When I began studying the history of witchcraft, it was still dominated, the subject was still dominated by one book, Keith Thomas's Religion and the Cloud of Magic. This is a classic example of the history from below, or the history of the ordinary person or people. It also explored the English experience of the early modern European witch craze, which claimed over 50,000 lives over a couple of hundred years. It also made witchcraft an academic subject that was acceptable in the wider scholarly field for historians. I began my PhD just after the second wave of witchcraft historians published their big books, and these are some of them. Well, Instruments of Darkness and Witchcraft, Magic and Culture by Owen Davis. Also, Stuart Clark published a big book at the same time called Thinking with Demons. These books challenged many ideas in Thomas's work, Religion and Kind of Magic. They gave gender a more prominent role because the vast majority of witches prosecuted and executed were women, 80% overall. Also suggested that many witchcraft accusations were not just rooted in conflict over charity in local areas, but interpersonal tensions and reputation. They also demonstrated that witchcraft belief carried on beyond the late 17th century, right up to the 19th century. You've just seen it here. The three papers you've just heard, I think, are part of the third wave of historical research into witchcraft and magic. These take the subject into unfamiliar and exciting territory, First of all, as you've just seen, they're using literally folklore and pictorial sources which earlier witchcraft historians would never have dreamed of using. Secondly, they're examining witchcraft and magic over a long period of time, traversing the chronological and conceptual categories which historians cling to for dear life: the early modern period, the 19th century, the Enlightened Age, the pre-famine period, to name but a few. Thirdly, they are studying a country still on the periphery of academic witchcraft study: Ireland. Ireland had been in the past missed out of every major academic study of witchcraft, magic and the supernatural. This preclusion is primarily based on the fundamentally incorrect assumption that because there were not many executions for witchcraft in Ireland, that witchcraft and magical belief didn't play an important part in the lives of ordinary people in Ireland. This lack of basic work in Irish witchcraft belief and trials became painfully apparent when I began to teach the subject as a historian at the University of Ulster on a module called Witchcraft and Magic in Britain and Ireland. That all three speakers at some point